Greetings and welcome to the podcast of Church and State, where we investigate people, their beliefs, and how it impacts their politics. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are simply of those of the people talking. They are not affiliated with any organization or group. We invite you to listen, to ask questions, and comment down below about any topics you would like us to cover. Thanks for listening. All right, everyone, we are back at the third episode of the Church and State podcast. We are currently still focused on the concept of separation of church and state. I'm again joined by my father.
Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be.
That's right. And so currently I was going to give a brief kind of overview of what we've already discussed and some key takeaways. So we've already discussed kind of the idea of separation of church and state. We dove into kind of the political and the historical application of that idea. We talked about Thomas Jefferson and where that concept came to be, really. And I wanted to correct something, and I can't remember if it's the first episode or the second episode, but there is a quote, and I gave credit to Thomas Jefferson, and it's actually John Adams. And the quote is, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." That's John Adams and not Thomas Jefferson. And that quote really talks about why, ironically, separation of church and state is important. And we talked about how it was initially intended where we needed in our new country the separation so that churches really weren't used as political pawns anymore, right? And so Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to the Danbury Church or Baptist Church, and that's where he addressed that concern of theirs. So it was never meant to mute or silence religious individuals from participating in politics, and it should not be used on the other side of individuals that are in politics trying to keep the religious people out. So there was some key takeaways that I wanted to kind of review and just reiterate, right? It's what the statement of separation church, what it was intended for and what it wasn't intended for. It was not intended, again, it was never meant that religious individuals could not participate or be involved in politics. And it should not be used as a way to push them out. And it was not a way to discourage religious individuals for taking an interest in politics either. And I've seen that both in the churches I've been in, whether they use it as a crutch and say, well, I'm not really interested in politics, or I don't feel like Christians should be involved in politics. And they use it almost as a crutch because they're like, oh, we got to keep those separate, and so I can't be involved in it. And that's something I've definitely seen. So in both ways, it was never intended to do those. Its real intention was to establish the church as an independent group to develop coming generations with a code of conduct. If you want to call it morals, ethics, code of conduct. But again, going back to that quote by John Adams, our Constitution was made to govern a moral society. And if we remove morals from society, then the Constitution is inherently worthless, really. It was also... its other goal was to end, I call it a vicious cycle. So if you study history, the marriage of church and state that had been seen in a lot of the European countries, and even before that in some of the countries in Asia, in Africa, the Middle East, there was a marriage of church and state. And what had happened with that marriage is the church was used as a political pawn. They could exercise mass propaganda and convince people very quickly of an idea, very similar to many of the monarchs had their subjects believing that it was their right to rule, right? That they had been given that right by God himself, right? So they were essentially not really, in certain cultures, I think in Egypt, they equated the pharaoh to a god, right? Is that correct?
They did.
Yeah.
And we see that in Rome as well.
Correct.
Right.
Yes. Where Caesar was God.
Right. And you were called upon to, in the later stages of the Roman Empire, you were called upon to worship Caesar.
Correct.
And that was one of the ploys that were used against the Christians, right? As they refused to worship the Caesar, the deity. So therefore, they were prosecuted or persecuted for that because they would refuse to worship Caesar in favor of worshiping God. And that was, you go back in your biblical text even to Jesus. I mean, that was one of the things that, remember, Pontius Pilate asked him, "Are you a king?" Right? And, my kingdom is not of this earth. Right?
Right.
So we begin to see that played out fundamentally throughout history, where the rulers of a society gained so much power and their word was taken with so much, impact that whatever they said was carried out, that they began to believe in themselves as a deity because they had this ultimate power. Whatever they said happened.
Correct.
And so for them, they were a deity.
Right.
That's the way it went.
Correct. And so to question the king was essentially to question God, and that's why if you look during the Crusades, there was a lot of people that were doing it because they couldn't question the right or wrong of the crusade. They just had to go. And that leads into the next point of convincing a citizen to blindly follow the government. So if the government has the church in its pocket, then they can tell the church leaders, hey, you got to tell them that this cause is worthy, this cause is beneficial, so they have to follow it blindly, right? And there's a lot of people that, because of their religious convictions, they will follow what the church leaders say. And so many people went on crusades because they believed that it was the right thing to do, right? It was God's will for them to go on this crusade. Another way they had seen the church, I'll say abused, was through taxation. I call it a form of taxation, but governments would have fundraising through the church under the disguise of the church, where people would give more and more money as tithing to the church, but the government would use those funds to their own interests and desires. So I think the church fathers, as much as they had, or not the church fathers, the founding fathers, I think the founding fathers had seen that almost firsthand with the Church of England, and they also were very well versed in history. They read a lot. And so I think they understood that was a natural progression of how the church and state interacted, and they wanted to put an end to that. And that's the conclusion of it. So as I said, the claim of separation of church and state has now devolved. So that's kind of, the background of everything we've discussed. So that claim has now devolved and is being used in two different ways, right? So religious people are hiding behind it. I think they're hiding behind it in a way, so that either they don't have to get involved in politics because there's a lot of challenges that come up in the political realm, right? You sometimes have to take a controversial opinion. You can offend somebody, or conversely, it's a way for them to claim the belief of Christianity, but then also vote in a completely different manner. And it's a way for non-religious individuals to push religious people out of the political realm. I always say, or often say, that it's easy to have freedom of speech if everyone talks like me.
Yeah, you don't want to suppress freedom of speech if everybody says what you're saying.
That's right. That's exactly right. So it's funny that, again, if everything's going your way, you don't have to be a patient person. You don't have to be a peaceful person because it's going your way, right?
Right. But going back to what you just said, so many people, they, as you said, sometimes religious people, they don't want to be involved in politics, right? Mm-hmm. Because they're saying that they don't want to try to mix their beliefs with politics. They don't want to be engaged with their neighbor in discussions. And in many ways, they're saying that I don't want to actually vocalize that I hold these beliefs. Sometimes I want to say, this is the belief of the church, and I belong to the church, and so therefore I hold this belief, it's a really there's a whole bunch of different complicated little methods that they can hide behind that, right? And get out of actually expressing what they really believe
Correct.
about things, right? They can hide behind that, so they don't actually have to express what they believe. They don't have to engage with their neighbors. They can just kind of stay what they think is in the background.
Right. And then what you see is moral degradation.
Yeah.
Right. Because no one's wanting to take a hard stand on anything.
Right.
Right. And the people that don't necessarily have a religious backing, I believe, fall into the more relativism, humanism realm. Truth is a relative concept, right? And as long as I don't hurt somebody, then I'm doing okay, right? And you fall into this weird, murky area, and you see, I mean, you can definitely see it in the country, is we are now okay with things that we used to not be, and it's not in any way benefiting society. As we move into that post-Christian society, a lot of people are scared, right? I was reading some statistics, and about 85% of the population are concerned, whether you hearken from a religious or non-religious background. It's a very high number that are still concerned about our moral well-being in the country. And it's scaring people as we swing more from, as you remove moral absolute out of a country, you move away from being a republic to a democracy, right? And a lot of people believe that we're a democracy. The U.S. was never intended to be a democracy. It was written as a republic, right? And just real quick, for those listening, if you're not sure what the difference is, so democracy is meaning of democracy means ruled by the people. Democracy refers to a system of government where the majority rules and laws and policies are determined by the collective will of the citizens. Conversely, a republic, the government is run by elected representatives who are accountable to the citizen. A key feature of the republic is the existence of a constitution that protects individual rights and limits the power of the government. To reduce both of those down, it's essentially rule of the many versus rule of the right? So for a republic to endure, morality, a code of conduct, however you decide it, that code has to be upheld above everything else, regardless of opinions or preferences. You have inalienable rights that were established, right? And so the sad thing is we've essentially utilized separation of church and state to basically, devolve our country into a democracy instead of remaining in a republic. So, which is a shame. So what I want to jump into next is how we untangle this mess, right? What's the solution to this issue?
Right, because I think most of us would agree that we've reached a kind of a tipping point, right, where we are. We're actually at a tipping point where religious people, in many cases, are afraid to engage in the public debate, either out of fear of the consequences of someone who may be their employer or their manager. There's plenty of examples of that out there. There are examples of lawfare where a political group may sue an individual or a small individual because of their positions that they take on political issues, and knowing full well that the small individual does not have the financial resources as the larger organization that is suing them, and therefore we are going to effectively punish them and use them as an example so that others out there are not going to put up a fight, or they're not going to let their voice be heard. We've moved beyond freedom of debate and freedom of opinion, and a society where we can actually conduct discussions about differing opinions, and we've moved into a very contentious area. And we see that expressed, like I said, in lawfare or in punishment for people for holding their beliefs. And we've got to move back from that, because it's the escalation of that. I mean, both sides can escalate that. a lot. You know,
And
it's
we're
one of
starting
those-
to see those
yeah,
results. Yeah.
we're starting to see that, right? I
Right.
mean, if you're on the liberal, or the more liberal spectrum of what we call the liberal spectrum of our culture, I mean, you may see that used against a more conservative. But guess what? The conservative side is going to look at those tactics and say, oh, that was a really good tactic. I think I'm going to use that against this person over here.
Right.
And so there are always, financial people that have a lot of financial resources, regardless of which part of the political spectrum you're on. And there's going to be people with less, and there's going to be people with more on the opposite end of that political spectrum who can take advantage of them and basically sue them into oblivion and use them as an example. So it's that almost the policy of mutually assured destruction, right?
Right.
And we've got to
Yeah.
move away from that. We have to move away from that. And we have to be able to find
In a funny way, we're right where the U.S. and Russia was, or the USSR during the Cold War, right?
Yeah.
Where we keep on coming up with bigger and bigger weapons, right? And we've got them pointed at each other, and we're just trying to see who chickens out first, right?
Right.
And it's escalating into arguments, violence, hostility, division, a lot of those things. And
Right.
it's not a good path for the country to be taking. And it's definitely not healthy for the upcoming generation to witness and try to live in.
Right.
So-
And the challenge of that is that there are those keywords and tricky phrases, I say, that we are instilling in this younger generation, as if someone deserved, a particular, whether it was they deserved to be put out of business, or they deserved
To be put to death.
to be put to death, or they deserved this type of punishment for holding an opinion.
Yes.
Nothing more than an opinion. And I don't think we really want to go there as a
No.
society. I mean, do we really want a society in which we legalize that basically if I disagree with you on a political subject, I can kill you?
Right.
Or maybe it's, if 25 of my friends sign a petition and say we disagree with this guy's opinion, us 25, if we've got 25 people, we can go kill them. Maybe not just one person, maybe we need 25, maybe we need 50.
Right.
And we don't really want a society where we say someone deserves to be bankrupted, or someone deserves to die, or someone deserves to be, imprisoned even because of a political opinion, a societal opinion
Correct.
that they hold. We don't want to devolve into that
Right.
kind of society. If you think about it, I don't care which side of the aisle you're on, you really don't want a society in which we are punishing people, regardless of what level of punishment you use, for holding an opinion, and not just holding an opinion, but expressing an opinion. We
Yes.
don't really want you to go to prison. We don't really want you to die. We don't really want you to be financially bankrupt because you hold an opinion. We've got to back away. We've got to walk away from that brink. That is an element of brinkmanship that we just have to back up from.
Thanks for listening to the podcast of Church and State, hosted by Jared and John. At the core, we hope that we've said something today that simply made you think and expand your horizons. Make sure to comment down below of things you want to hear or topics you want covered. We'll see you on the next one.